Welcome, champions, to my first ever single champion tier ranking. We finally caught up with the seat-by-seat tier lists and have the all champions tier list, so now we're able to rank them as they release and throw them into the overall list. So let's talk about Virgil, the neutral good ASMR sorcerer, the event he's tied to, Feast of the Moon, and his affiliation, the Rivals of Waterdeep. To start off, he'll serve your formation as a speed and support, and makes his home in Seat 10. Having a dedicated speed champion in Seat 10 is quite welcome, as previously that sole honor belonged to Havilar, and hers was very situational. His primary form of support comes from Storm Sorcerer, where he increases the damage of champions adjacent to him, while also making them attack faster. It is very clearly represented with the aura that surrounds affected champions. As far as raw numbers go, a fairly standard buff, but he also gains Weather Control, where he gains a weather stack each time the weather changes in your current run, when advancing to a new area, or otherwise changed by an ultimate attack. Each weather type between no weather, thunderstorm, fog, and snow can each stack up to 500, and are multiplied by 10%, then multiplied together. This starts out as a very small buff, and passively will not scale super hard on its own, but if you take the time to micromanage the stacks, this gets on par and even exceeds Storm Sorcerer. So we're talking some hefty potential levels of double buffing, but it's very time consuming to stack up. The trick here is no weather stacks, as fog, snow, and thunder can be stacked up via ultimates. No weather requires actual area progression. You cannot go back and do it with a completed area. So, to maximize this buff, you would need to be sure to change the weather with an ultimate, then progress to a new area, at least 500 times in your current run. Do note there are a very few places this simply cannot be achieved, in the likes of Rime of the Frost Maiden, as most areas are snowing by default, so there will be no option to gain the no weather. So, how do you reliably change the weather? That's where some of his affiliation comes in. To start, Virgil's own ultimate attack attacks a random enemy with lightning, chaining up to 20 times, but also changing the weather to thunder. Kent in Seat 4, with which he shares Inseparable, where if one of them can enter a variant or restriction, so can the other, who also has an ultimate that changes weather to fog. Then Gazric, the gold-hungry gnome from their affiliation in Seat 7, has an ultimate attack that changes the weather to snow. So for the best result, you'll want to slot all of them and alternate their ultimate attacks as you progress. Have one of them ult to change the area's weather, then progress so it changes back to no weather, then use one, then progress, etc. For his speed, he gains Rapid Fire, where if any enemy is defeated within 2 seconds of being spawned on screen, they have a 5% chance to drop double quest items or count for double quest progress, for each Rivals of Waterdeep champion in the formation, stacking additively. Think of him like a Walmart version of Human. It has worse scaling, so it takes a lot more investment to really get going, and it only works for 2 seconds after the enemy spawns. So nowhere near as good, but the same basic concept. Overall, if you do choose to invest and get it to at least 100, it's not bad, but it's not the greatest. He also gets a little angry when someone in your formation dies, causing both his primary attack and ultimate to turn red and debuff the enemy, making them take more damage. Multiple attacks will only refresh this debuff, not stack it, and it does not have any forms of scaling. No gear, no feats, nothing. So what you get is what you get. But considering it's a third buff from him, on top of one flat standard buff, and one potential really good buff, that's not all that outlandish. Since this is a mechanic tied to when a champion dies, do note that Blushi, Spurt, and Veronica do count for this mechanic in their pseudo-dead states. Simply slotting Veronica, or having Spurt and Blushi in their spirit forms will indeed make this buff active. His specializations will change the color of his primary attack and ult based on his mood, between relaxed green, increasing Storm Sorcerer's damage boost by 100% and attack cooldown reduction by 25%. or Anxious Amber, giving his primary and ult a 25% chance to stun, or Determined Violet, increasing Weather Control's damage boost by 33% for each of his affiliations slotted. So, let's briefly talk about the event he's tied to and his overall affiliation. The Feast of the Moon currently features Whittle in Seat 2, Penelope in Seat 12, and our newcomer Virgil in Seat 10. I often have a pretty clear-cut opinion on who you'd want to focus on, but this is actually a bit of a toughie. All three of them are good in their respective seats, and it really depends on what you are focusing on at the time. Both Whittle and Virgil are usable for speed formations and offer decent buffs with attack speed bonuses. In Whittle's case, she might be better for speed and Virgil better for the buffing potential. And Penelope is a great buffer, clutch for debuffing, and has excellent crowd control. If you want to know about the other two in more depth, I recommend checking out my tier list videos featuring their respective seats, where I break them down. At the end of the day, your overall goal should always be to unlock all of them and do what you can to get them epicked out. But if you either have limited resources, or you're at a point where you can just farm them for item level boosts, this one really comes down to preference. His variants for this event should be doable by most everyone, though one of them might give you some trouble. All of them force Virgil to be in your formation, and for the first one he can't be moved. All you need to do for that first one is make sure your DPS is adjacent to him and you're pretty much good to go. For the second, you can't use anyone with a wisdom of 11 or below. This could potentially hurt some newcomers, but most should be able to breeze by this no problem. The two others from this event, Penelope and Whittle, are usable for it, and while a few core champions are locked out, it's not too many. Kent is a great DPS to slot, as many people are liable to have him from the last event, and as the Season of Erebus is still going on with their reduced time gate cost, you're likely to also have some of them on hand. Ayla and Quillic working quite well. Also keep in mind all of the rivals of Waterdeep are viable, as Kent is the only one below the wisdom threshold, but with Inseparable, Virgil can bring him in. And lastly, one of those rare times you're actually going to want some form of healing or shielding. Every 5 areas the weather changes. Snowing will slow your attack speed, thunder will deal damage to a random champion every 5 seconds, dealing 50% of their maximum health while stunning them for 5 seconds. And fog will make ranged attackers deal no damage. So, rely on Virgil's attack speed increase, get some healers, and don't use a ranged DPS. Though this variant is half decent for Virgil's achievement if you feel like slapping 2 balls with one hand. Speaking of that achievement, Weathering the Storm is overall fairly easy to achieve, but will take a bit of time if you don't have his other members, Gazric and Kent, and potentially pair them with Dungeon Master and Human to reduce ultimate cooldown. This simply requires you to get 100 total weather control stacks. So just be sure you do the dance of changing the weather via an ultimate before progressing to an area that has no weather, and you'll have this by roughly area 100. But if you do have all those champions, just spam those ults until you get it. His affiliation is overall decent, with some gimmicks, and one champion that holds them all back. Solis in Seat 12 is a strong tank and alright buffer. Shaka in Seat 9 is a decent buffer, but is gimmicky with his puzzle placement. Gazric in Seat 7 is also a decent buffer with some great gold find. Kent in Seat 4 is a decent DPS and good buffer. And then we have Dahani, the subpar DPS and pseudo subpar buffer / gold find, depending on specialization choices. The problem here is if you want to use the entire affiliation, you'd need to focus on Dahani as your DPS. Even with her way of the brush at 10 stacks and above, at equal item level, Kent will probably always out DPS her. The reason this is so unfortunate is the affiliation has formation abilities that scale with how many of the rivals of Waterdeep you have slotted. If you want to use this affiliation, you're likely better off benching Dahani for a better buffer from slot 1, like Orkira or Veronica to synergize with Virgil's Angie mode. But if you feel connected to this affiliation and want to use them all together as a team, go for it, baby. At the end of the day, he's good. Pretty good, in fact. I do feel like the amount of which you need to farm up weather control does hold him back a bit. He's a triple buffer with one that scales decently high with some farming. He's also an alright speed champion, though with his speed definitely not the best scaling. Also, he's available for every patron, requiring a feat for Zariel. But in doing so also makes Kent viable for Zariel, and therefore every patron via Inseparable. Overall, I think he is an A+ champion. Stay tuned because I'm always working on the next one. Hit that like, sub, and bell, and always remember to have a hell of a time out there, champion.